The confession came on a Thursday morning,
I wish I
38
could
years
forget
too
it.
late. An elderly man sat trembling in an Arizona police station, his weathered hands gripping the edge of a metal
I
table,
wish I could
and
forget
spoke
it.
5 words that would unravel everything. I helped bury Grace Brooks. But here's what nobody expected. The man confessing wasn't the killer. He was the witness who'd been silent for nearly 4 decades, and the person he was about to expose was already dead. A decorated officer, a pillar of the community, a monster hiding behind a badge. This is the story of how one confession meant to protect a murderer's legacy accidentally revealed the darkest secret in Mesa, Arizona's history. And if you think you know how this ends, I promise,
Grace.
you don't. Before we go further, if
Where
stories
are
like
you?
this grip you the way they grip me, hit that
Please
subscribe
come
button
home.
right now.
Grace.
It helps the algorithm guide more of these untold mysteries
Where
straight
are
to
you?
you. Drop a comment telling
Please
me where you're
come
watching
home.
from, because every share, every like keeps these forgotten voices alive. Let me take you back to where it all began, August 1986. The Arizona desert burned under a merciless sun, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance above the asphalt. In the small town of Mesa, 16-year-old Grace Brooks was supposed to be home by 9 o'clock. She never made it. Grace wasn't the kind of girl who broke rules. Honor student, quiet. The type who kept her head down and her grades up, working summer shifts at Rosie's Diner to help her single mother pay rent. She had dreams of college, of escaping the desert heat for somewhere cooler, somewhere that felt like possibility. But on that August night, Grace walked out of Rosie's Diner carrying a backpack that didn't belong to her, moving toward the desert highway like she was being pulled by invisible strings. A trucker passing through town would later tell police he saw a teenage girl walking fast, looking over her shoulder every few seconds, her face tight with fear. He thought about stopping. He didn't. That decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. By midnight, Grace's mother called the police, voice cracking with panic. By dawn, search teams combed the desert roads. By sunset the next day, they found something that made every officer's blood run cold. Grace's silver necklace, a delicate chain with a tiny cross her grandmother had given her, was buried 6 inches deep in the sand near a remote dirt road. Not lost, not dropped. Buried. Deliberately hidden, as if someone wanted it found, but only by those who knew where to look. But there were no footprints around the necklace. No tire tracks, no signs of struggle. It was as if Grace had simply evaporated into the desert heat, leaving behind only that one small piece of herself. The town erupted in whispers. Some said she ran away with a boyfriend nobody knew about. Others insisted they'd seen a strange truck circling the diner that week, a man inside watching the young waitresses through tinted windows. The theories multiplied, each one more desperate than the last, because the truth was too terrifying to consider. That a girl could vanish in plain sight and leave nothing behind but questions. Mesa Police Department threw everything they had at the case. Interviews, ground searches, bloodhounds tracking scents that led nowhere. They questioned Grace's co-workers, her classmates, even the regulars at Rosie's Diner who'd seen her smile while pouring coffee just hours before she disappeared. One name kept surfacing. Mark Delaney, 19 years old, Grace's co-worker and the last person to see her alive. He told police she'd seemed nervous that night, distracted like something was weighing on her mind. He said she left through the back door instead of the front. He said he'd offered her a ride home, she'd refused. His story was clean. Too clean, some thought. But there was no evidence tying him to anything, no reason to hold him, no thread to pull that might unravel the truth. The investigation dragged on for 3 months before it quietly died, suffocated by dead ends and departmental budget cuts. Grace's case file was marked Unsolved and placed in a cabinet where forgotten tragedies went to gather dust. But Grace never truly disappeared from Mesa's collective memory. Her photograph remained tacked to the bulletin board inside the police station, a teenage girl with dark eyes full of hope, frozen forever at 16. Officers would walk past it every day, and some would pause, wondering what happened to the girl in the picture, wondering if they'd missed something obvious, something that would have brought her home. Grace's mother never stopped searching, never stopped believing her daughter was out there somewhere waiting to be found. She plastered missing person flyers on every telephone pole, ran newspaper ads on the anniversary of Grace's disappearance, stood outside the police station demanding answers until her voice went hoarse. The years passed. Detectives retired. Witnesses moved away or died. The file grew colder. And then in 2024, everything changed. A newly hired cold case detective named Lena Hart pulled Grace's file during a routine review of unsolved cases. Something immediately struck her as wrong. Inconsistencies in witness statements that had been overlooked, evidence that had never been properly analyzed, and one piece of paper that should have cracked the case wide open 38 years ago. A page torn from Grace's diary found in her locker at the diner, containing one sentence written in shaky handwriting. "I think someone is following me." That sentence pulled Detective Hart into the darkness. She had no idea she was about to uncover a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of law enforcement. A betrayal so profound, it would shake Mesa to its foundation. And it all began with that Thursday morning confession from a 72-year-old man who'd carried his secret like a stone in his chest for nearly 4 decades. But here's what you need to understand. Ethan Ward didn't confess because his conscience finally broke him. He confessed because he thought the real killer was dead, and dead men can't defend themselves against accusations. He thought he was safe. He was wrong. Detective Lena Hart had seen her share of cold cases during her 15 years in law enforcement, but none of them had grabbed her the way Grace Brooks did. Maybe it was the girl's eyes in that faded photograph, still radiating innocence despite decades of dust settling over her file. Maybe it was the sloppy investigation that followed her disappearance, full of holes big enough to drive a truck through. Or maybe it was the instinct every good detective develops, that sixth sense that screams when something is buried deeper than it should be. Hart spent 3 weeks living inside Grace's case file before the confession arrived. 3 weeks of reconstructing a 1986 investigation through yellowed reports, witness statements that contradicted each other, and evidence logs that raised more questions than answers. The original lead detective, a man named Richard Moss, had retired in 1994 and died of a heart attack 6 years later. Most of the officers who worked the case were either dead or suffering from memories eroded by time, but the files remained, and files don't forget. Hart discovered that Mark Delaney, Grace's 19-year-old co-worker, had given 3 different versions of his final conversation with Grace. In his first statement, he said she left at 8:45. In his second, he changed it to 9:15. In his third statement, given 2 months after Grace vanished, he claimed she'd seemed paranoid and mentioned something about seeing things she shouldn't have seen. That last detail had been buried on page 47 of the file, mentioned once and never followed up on. Hart circled it in red ink, her pulse quickening. Seeing things she shouldn't have seen. What things? The answer came from an unlikely source, Grace's diary page. The original investigators had dismissed it as teenage anxiety, nothing more than a girl's overactive imagination. But Hart read it differently. "I think someone is following me" wasn't written in the dramatic scrawl of an attention-seeking teenager. The handwriting was tight, compressed, the words pressed hard into the paper as if Grace's hand had been shaking when she wrote them. This was fear, real fear. Hart ordered the diary page sent to the lab for additional analysis, knowing the technology available in 2024 far exceeded what existed in 1986. Maybe there were fingerprints that had been missed. Maybe there was trace evidence trapped in the paper fibers. Maybe there was something that would crack this case wide open. She never got the chance to find out. Because that's when Ethan Ward's email arrived. The message came through the department's online tip portal at 6:32 on a Thursday morning. Hart was the first person to see it, sitting at her desk with her second cup of coffee, scrolling through the usual noise. Anonymous conspiracy theories, attention seekers confessing to crimes they didn't commit, psychics claiming they'd channeled victims from beyond. But Ethan's message was different. It was simple, direct, and carried the weight of truth in every word. "I need to confess to the disappearance of Grace Brooks." Hart's coffee went cold as she stared at the screen. She ran Ethan Ward's name through every database available. No criminal record, no prior contact with law enforcement, no connection to Mesa in 1986. He'd been living in Phoenix back then, working as a truck mechanic at a garage 40 miles from where Grace disappeared. So why was he confessing? Hart assembled a small team, 2 junior detectives and a prosecutor who specialized in cold cases, and drove 90 minutes to Tucson, where Ethan now lived in a retirement community called Desert Springs. The place was clean and cheerful in that aggressive way retirement homes often are, with pastel walls and artificial plants that never died. Ethan was waiting for them in the community center, sitting in a plastic chair with his hands folded in his lap. He looked smaller than Hart had imagined, a thin man with papery skin and eyes that had seen too much. When he stood to shake her hand, his grip was weak, but his gaze was steady. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly, as if they were there for tea instead of a murder confession. They moved to a private room the facility manager had provided. Hart set up a recording device, read Ethan his rights, and waited. The silence stretched between them like a living thing. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I didn't kill Grace Brooks," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "But I know who did, and I know why." Hart leaned forward, every nerve in her body alive with anticipation. This was the moment cases pivoted on, the moment when secrets buried for decades finally clawed their way to the surface. "Tell me everything," she said, but Ethan shook his head, tears gathering in his eyes. "Not yet. First, I need to know that Grace's mother is informed. I need to know she's prepared to hear the truth. Because what I'm about to tell you will destroy everything she thought she knew about her daughter's disappearance." Hart felt frustration rise in her chest, but she forced it down. She'd been in enough interrogation rooms to recognize when someone was negotiating their own terms, trying to maintain control over a narrative that had controlled them for far too long. "Grace's mother deserves to know her daughter's story," Hart said carefully. "Help me give that to her. Help me bring Grace home." Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for the cup of water on the table. He drank slowly, buying time, wrestling with demons Hart could only imagine. "There was a criminal operation running through Mesa in 1986, he finally said. "Small time at first. Stolen goods, fenced merchandise, the kind of thing that flies under the radar in a town that size. Grace saw something one night behind the diner where she worked, something that connected people she shouldn't have seen together." Hart's mind raced. This aligned with Mark Delaney's buried statement about Grace seeing things she shouldn't have seen. Who did she see? Ethan met her eyes, and in that moment, Hart saw the full weight of his 38-year burden. "She saw a deputy sheriff loading stolen electronics into a truck," Ethan whispered. "A man everyone trusted, a man who was supposed to protect her." The room went completely silent. Hart's blood turned to ice as the implications crashed over her. A law enforcement officer involved in the criminal operation, a law enforcement officer who would have had access to Grace's case file, who could have steered the investigation away from the truth, who could have buried evidence and manipulated witness statements. "Give me his name," Hart demanded. Ethan's voice was barely audible. "Deputy Ron Halstead. He died 2 weeks ago. That's why I'm here now. That's why I can finally speak." And just like that, everything Hart thought she knew about Grace Brooks's disappearance shattered into 1,000 pieces, revealing something far darker underneath. If you're still with me, drop a comment right now. Tell me what you think happened to Grace, because I promise you, the truth is worse than anything you're imagining. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because this story is about to take turns that will leave you speechless. Ron Halstead's name hung in the air like poison gas, suffocating every assumption Hart had made about this case. She'd reviewed his file on the drive back to Mesa, her jaw clenching tighter with each page. Deputy Ron Halstead had been a decorated officer, 32 years of service, commendations for bravery, community service awards. He'd coached Little League Baseball, organized neighborhood watch programs, and attended every town hall meeting with a smile that made people feel safe. When he retired in 2003, the mayor gave him a plaque. When he died of cancer 2 weeks ago, his funeral drew over 300 people. And according to Ethan Ward, this pillar of the community had murdered a 16-year-old girl. But Hart needed more than accusations from a frightened old man. She needed evidence. She needed proof that would hold up in a court of law, even if Halstead was beyond prosecution, because this wasn't just about one corrupt cop anymore. This was about every case he'd ever touched, every arrest he'd ever made, every testimony he'd ever given. If Halstead was dirty, the entire department's credibility was on the line. She started with the original investigation files, this time reading them through a different lens. What she found made her stomach turn. Halstead had been assigned as the secondary officer on Grace's case, working directly under Detective Moss. His name appeared on dozens of evidence logs, witness interview reports, and search coordination documents. He'd been present when Grace's necklace was discovered. He'd personally interviewed Mark Delaney. He'd been the one to suggest the investigation focus on the possibility that Grace had run away, and he'd been the officer who logged Grace's diary page into evidence, which meant he'd seen her fear, seen her mention of being followed, and had chosen to bury it. Hart's hands shook as she cross-referenced dates. Grace disappeared on August 14th. The stolen electronics Ethan mentioned would have been fenced through local pawn shops or moved out of state. She pulled every theft report filed in Mesa between June and October of 1986, looking for patterns. What emerged was stunning. 23 burglaries in 4 months, all targeting electronics stores, warehouses, and shipping facilities. The stolen merchandise was never recovered. No arrests were ever made, and every single investigation had been closed by the same person, Deputy Ron Halstead. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired pawn shop owner named Eddie Gonzalez, who Hart tracked down living in a nursing home in Scottsdale. Eddie had been running a shop called Southwest Exchange in 1986, and Hart had a hunch he might remember something about the stolen goods moving through Mesa. Eddie was 84, confined to a wheelchair, but his mind was sharp as broken glass. When Hart showed him Halstead's photograph, his face went pale. "I know that man," Eddie whispered. "He came into my shop 3, maybe 4 times in '86. Always at closing time, always alone. He'd bring merchandise in the back door, no receipts, no questions. Paid me cash to keep my mouth shut." "What kind of merchandise?" Hart asked, her recorder running. "Electronics mostly. Stereos, VCRs, computer equipment, expensive stuff still in boxes. I knew it was hot, but you didn't say no to a cop back then. Not if you wanted to keep your business license." Hart leaned closer. "Did you ever see anyone else with him?" Eddie nodded slowly. "Once. Late August, maybe a week or 2 after some girl went missing. I remember because it was all over the news. Halstead came in with a younger guy, maybe 19, 20 years old. Skinny kid, nervous energy. They argued in my back room about splitting money. The kid wanted more. Halstead told him to shut up or he'd end up like the girl." Hart's pulse hammered in her ears. "Do you remember what the kid looked like?" "Dark hair, acne scars on his cheeks. Worked at a diner, I think. He had grease stains on his shirt." Mark Delaney. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Grace had witnessed Halstead and Mark moving stolen goods behind the diner. She'd become a liability, and when she decided to report what she'd seen, they'd silenced her permanently. But one question still haunted Hart. Where was Ethan Ward in all of this? She returned to Tucson 3 days later, this time without the junior detectives. This conversation needed to be private, one-on-one, with no distractions. Ethan was waiting in the same community center, looking even smaller than before, as if his confession had physically diminished him. "I need to know your role in this," and Hart said without preamble. "No more partial truths, no more protecting yourself. If you want any chance at redemption, you tell me everything right now." Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "I was a mechanic. I worked on Halstead's truck every few months. One night in August, he showed up at my garage after hours, alone, and told me he needed a favor. Said it was police business, classified, couldn't go through official channels." "What did he ask you to do?" "Drive a girl out of town. He said she was a witness in a case, that someone dangerous was after her, that he needed to relocate her somewhere safe until the trial. He showed me his badge, his credentials. I trusted him." Hart's voice was ice. "And you drove Grace Brooks out into the desert?" Ethan nodded, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "She was terrified, crying, begging me to take her home. I kept telling her everything would be okay, that Deputy Halstead was going to protect her. I believed that. I swear to God I believed that." "Where did you take her?" "An old service road about 30 miles outside Mesa. Halstead was waiting there in his personal truck. He paid me $500 cash and told me to forget everything I'd seen. Said if I talked, he'd make sure I went to prison for kidnapping." "And you just left her there with him?" Ethan's voice broke completely. "She was alive when I drove away. I thought Halstead was taking her to a safe house. I thought I was helping save her life. Hart wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that Ethan was just another victim of Halstead's manipulation. But something didn't add up. If Ethan truly believed he was helping, why had he stayed silent for 38 years? Why had fear kept him quiet even after Halstead retired, even after Halstead's influence had faded? "What aren't you telling me?" Hart demanded. Ethan looked away, his jaw working silently. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush. 2 days after I drove Grace out there, I went back to the service road. I don't know why, curiosity, guilt, something pulling me back. I found tire tracks, disturbed earth, and one of my work tarps buried partially in the sand. The tarp I kept in my truck bed for covering machinery. Hart felt ice water pour through her veins. "You knew she was dead. You knew you'd been part of it." "I didn't know for certain," Ethan protested weakly. "I suspected, I feared, but I couldn't prove anything, and Halstead had already threatened my family, my wife, my daughter. He knew where they lived. What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to tell the truth," Hart said coldly. "You were supposed to save Grace Brooks." The silence between them was damning. Finally, Hart stood. "You're under arrest as an accessory to kidnapping and murder. Whatever deal you thought you'd make by confessing, it's off the table. You helped bury that girl, and now you're going to help me find her." As officers led Ethan away in handcuffs, Hart felt no satisfaction. Only a deep, aching anger at how many people had failed Grace Brooks. Not just her killers, but everyone who'd chosen silence over justice. But the investigation was far from over. Because if Ethan's tarp was buried with Grace, that meant he'd seen the grave. That meant he knew exactly where she was. And Hart was going to make him remember every single detail. The interrogation room at Mesa Police Department felt smaller than it should have. Walls closing in as Ethan Ward sat across from Detective Hart, with his court-appointed attorney beside him. The lawyer, a tired-looking woman named Patricia Chen, had already advised Ethan to stop talking. But Ethan seemed beyond caring about legal strategy now. The dam had broken, and 38 years of secrets were flooding out whether his attorney liked it or not. Hart spread a topographical map of the desert surrounding Mesa across the table, her finger tracing the service road Ethan had described. "Show me exactly where you left Grace with Halstead." Ethan's hand shook as he pointed to a section of road that no longer existed, paved over by highway expansion in the late 90s. "Here, about 30 miles out, where the road curved near the rock formations that looked like fingers pointing at the sky." "And when you returned 2 days later, where did you find the disturbed earth?" Ethan's finger moved slightly west, to an area marked as Bureau of Land Management Territory, public land that stretched for hundreds of empty miles. Maybe a quarter-mile off the road, there was a wash, a dried creek bed. The sand was darker there, recently moved. Hart made notes, her mind already assembling search teams, ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs. After 38 years, there wouldn't be much left. But bones didn't disappear. Bones told stories that flesh couldn't. But before she could authorize a search that would cost the department tens of thousands of dollars, she needed to understand the full scope of what happened that night. Because Ethan's story still had holes in it, gaps where truth should have been. "Let's talk about Mark Delaney," Hart said, changing direction. "You said you overheard conversations while working on Halstead's truck. What exactly did you hear?" Ethan took a shaky breath. "Halstead came to my garage 3, maybe 4 times in the months before Grace disappeared, always late at night. Sometimes Mark was with him. They'd talk in the parking lot while I worked, thought I couldn't hear them through the bay door. But sound carries in garages, every word echoes." "What did they talk about?" "Money, mostly. Mark complained about his cut being too small. Halstead would tell him to be patient, that they were building something bigger. They talked about shipments, about moving merchandise through Phoenix, and they talked about the girl at the diner who asked too many questions." Hart's pulse quickened. "Grace, they mentioned her by name?" "Not at first, just the nosy waitress or the Brooks girl. But about a week before she disappeared, Mark came to the garage alone, panicking. Said Grace had seen him and Halstead loading a truck behind the diner, that she'd written everything down in her diary. He was terrified she was going to report them." "What did Halstead say when Mark told him?" Ethan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He said, 'Then we'll make sure she doesn't get the chance.'" I should have known what that meant. I should have warned someone. But I was a coward who convinced himself it was just tough talk, that cops don't actually hurt innocent kids. The weight of that realization sat heavy in the room. Ethan had heard the plan forming and done nothing. He'd been a witness to the conspiracy before it became murder. After you drove Grace to the desert, did you ever see Mark Delaney again? Hart asked. Ethan shook his head. He left town a few months later. I heard he moved to California, maybe Oregon. I never looked for him. Didn't want to know. Hart made a note to track down Mark Delaney immediately. If he was still alive, he was the only other person who could corroborate Ethan's story, the only other witness who could confirm Halstead's role. But 38 years was a long time. People disappeared. People changed names. People died. Still, she had to try. Here's what I don't understand, Hart said, leaning forward. You claim you thought you were helping Grace, that Halstead manipulated you into believing this was official police business. But you saw your tarp at the burial site. You knew something terrible had happened. Why didn't you come forward then? Ethan's face crumpled. Because Halstead came to my house the next morning. He sat in my kitchen, drank coffee my wife made him, and played with my 6-year-old daughter. The whole time he smiled at me like we were old friends. Then, when my wife left the room, he leaned close and said, "Accidents happen to families who can't keep secrets. Would be a shame if your little girl got hurt crossing the street." The threat was clear, brutal, and perfectly calibrated to ensure silence. Hart had seen this pattern before. Predators who understood that the most effective leverage wasn't threatening the person directly, but threatening the people they loved. So you stayed quiet to protect your family, Hart said, not quite a question. I told myself that every day for 38 years, Ethan replied, tears running freely now. I told myself Grace was already gone, that coming forward wouldn't bring her back, that sacrificing my daughter's safety wouldn't change anything. I built a whole life on top of that lie. What changed? Hart asked. Why confess now after all this time? Ethan wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. My daughter died 3 years ago. Cancer, same disease that took Halstead. And my wife passed 6 months after that. Broken heart, the doctor said, but I knew the truth. She died from living with a man who couldn't tell her the worst thing he'd ever done. He looked directly at Hart, his gaze steady despite the tears. I have nothing left to protect anymore. No family to shield, no future to preserve. When I heard Halstead died, I realized I was the last person alive who knew what really happened to Grace Brooks. If I died without talking, her story would die with me. Her mother would never know. The truth would stay buried forever. Hart felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of the complicated nature of confession. Ethan wasn't a monster, but he wasn't a hero either. He was something far more human and far more tragic. A man who'd made a terrible choice under threat and then spent 4 decades drowning in the consequences. The truth doesn't stay buried, Hart said quietly. It always finds a way to surface. You should have learned that by now. Ethan nodded. I know, that's why I'm here. Hart gathered the maps, the notes, the pieces of a puzzle that was finally taking shape. She had Ethan's confession, Eddie's testimony about the criminal operation, and enough evidence to prove Halstead was corrupt. What she didn't have was Grace's body or Mark Delaney's corroboration. But she was going to find both. As she stood to leave, Ethan called out, Detective Hart, when you find her and when you bring Grace home, will you tell her mother that I'm sorry? Will you tell her that some of us never forgot? Hart paused at the door, considering her response. Finally, she said, I'll tell her the truth. What she does with it is her choice, not mine. And with that, she walked out, already planning the search that would either confirm everything Ethan had said or prove him to be just another manipulator trying to control the narrative from inside a jail cell. Either way, Grace Brooks deserved to be found, and Hart wasn't going to stop until she was. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because the next chapter reveals something nobody saw coming, not even Ethan Ward. And if this case has gripped you the way it's gripped me, hit that subscribe button. These stories need to be told, and your support makes sure they reach the people who need to hear them most. Finding Mark Delaney took Hart exactly 4 days. He wasn't hiding in California or Oregon like Ethan had guessed. He was living 23 miles from Mesa, in a suburb called Gilbert, under his own name, working as a regional manager for a plumbing supply company. He had a wife, 2 grown children, a mortgage, and a completely unremarkable life that gave no indication he'd been involved in the murder of a teenage girl 38 years ago. Hart watched him through the window of his office, a middle-aged man with gray temples and reading glasses, reviewing invoices with the kind of mundane concentration that belonged to someone whose biggest concern was quarterly sales figures. He looked nothing like the 19-year-old accomplice Ethan had described. Time had transformed him from a scared kid into someone's father, someone's husband, someone who coached youth soccer on weekends. But time didn't erase murder. It just made it easier to pretend it never happened. Hart walked into his office without knocking, her badge already visible. Mark looked up, confused at first. Then his face went completely white as recognition dawned. He knew exactly why she was there. "Mark Delaney," Hart said, closing the door behind her. "We need to talk about Grace Brooks." For a long moment, Mark just stared at her, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Then, without warning, he stood and walked to the small window overlooking the parking lot, his hands gripping the windowsill so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I wondered when this day would come," he said quietly. 38 years, and I wondered every single day." Hart pulled out a chair and sat, letting the silence work on him. Sometimes the best interrogation technique was simply giving someone space to confess. "Ron Halstead is dead," Mark continued, still facing the window. "I saw his obituary 2 weeks ago. Thought maybe the secret died with him. But secrets don't die, do they? They just wait." "Tell me what happened," Hart said. "All of it from the beginning." Mark turned, and Hart saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not fear, but relief. As if he'd been carrying a weight so heavy that even prison would feel lighter than continuing to hold it. "I was 19 and stupid," Mark began, lowering himself back into his chair. "Working minimum wage at a diner, barely making rent. Halstead recruited me through his nephew, who worked the same shift. Said there was easy money in moving merchandise, no questions asked. Just load and unload trucks a few nights a month. And you agreed." "I agreed. The money was good and Halstead was a cop. I figured if he was involved, it couldn't be that serious. That's how he worked. Used his badge like armor, made everyone feel safe even while he was breaking the law." Hart leaned forward. "When did Grace become a problem?" Mark's face twisted with an emotion Hart couldn't quite read. "July, maybe early August. She was working the late shift one night, and she'd forgotten her jacket. Came back through the alley to get it and saw us loading electronics into Halstead's truck. She just stood there frozen, watching. Halstead smiled at her, told her it was police evidence, nothing to worry about. But I could see in her eyes that she didn't believe him." "What did Halstead say after she left?" "He was furious. Said she was going to ruin everything, that we needed to figure out how to handle her. I suggested we could pay her off, make her part of it. But Halstead said no, said she was too righteous, too scared. Said girls like that always talked eventually." Hart's jaw clenched. "So he decided to kill her." Mark shook his head violently. "No, not at first. He wanted to scare her into silence. He went to her house, talked to her mother, established himself as the friendly neighborhood cop. Made Grace feel like she could trust him. Then he told me to befriend her at work, find out if she'd told anyone what she saw. Had she? She wrote it in her diary. She showed me once, said she was documenting everything in case something happened to her. She was terrified, but she was also smart. Too smart." Mark's voice cracked. "I told Halstead about the diary, and that's when everything changed. He said we couldn't let her report us. Said we had no choice." Hart felt cold fury building in her chest. "You had a choice. You could have walked away. You could have warned her." "I know," Mark whispered. "I know that now. But I was a kid who thought he was in too deep, who believed Halstead when he said we'd all go to prison if Grace talked. He convinced me that silencing her was self-defense, that we were protecting ourselves from an unfair system." "How did he kill her?" The question hung in the air like a knife. Mark closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, his voice was hollow. "He didn't tell me the plan. Just said to make sure Grace worked the closing shift on August 14th, that everything would be handled. I thought maybe he was going to threaten her, or plant evidence to discredit her. I didn't know." He trailed off, unable to finish. "You didn't know he was going to murder her," Hart said flatly, "but you suspected and you did nothing." Mark's silence was confirmation enough. Hart pulled out crime scene photos, witness statements, everything she'd compiled over the past weeks. Here's what I know. Halstead used a mechanic named Ethan Ward to transport Grace under false pretenses. Ethan thought he was protecting a witness. Instead, he delivered her to her execution. Halstead killed her somewhere in the desert and buried her with Ethan's tarp to ensure mutual silence. Mark's face went even paler. I didn't know about Ethan. Halstead never told me who helped him. Because he compartmentalized, Hart said. Kept everyone separate so no one person knew the full truth. Classic criminal organization technique. But here's what I don't understand. You disappeared for a few months after Grace died, then came back to Mesa like nothing happened. Why? Mark's laugh was bitter. Halstead wouldn't let me leave permanently. Said if I ran, he'd know I was guilty, that he'd make sure I took the fall for everything. He kept me on a leash for years, checking in, reminding me what would happen if I talked. Even after I moved to Gilbert, got married, started over, he'd call once a year just to let me know he was still watching. Until he died. Until he died, Mark confirmed. And for 2 weeks I thought maybe I was finally free. Then you walked through that door. Hart stood, her decision already made. Mark Delaney, you're under arrest as an accessory to the kidnapping and murder of Grace Brooks. You have the right to remain silent. I'll tell you everything, Mark interrupted. Every location, every conversation, every person involved. I'll testify, cooperate, whatever you need. Just please. His voice broke completely. Please tell Grace's mother that I'm sorry. That not a day has passed when I didn't see her face, didn't hear her voice, that I've lived in my own prison for 38 years. Hart snapped the handcuffs onto his wrists, her expression unmoved. Sorry doesn't bring her home, but your testimony might. So you're going to remember every single detail, and you're going to help me find her body. As she led Mark out through the office, past co-workers whose faces registered shock and confusion, Hart felt the case finally crystallizing. She had 2 confessions now, 2 pieces of the same terrible puzzle. All that remained was finding Grace herself. But what neither Ethan nor Mark knew, what nobody except Detective Hart was about to discover, was that Ron Halstead had left behind one final piece of evidence that would crack this case wide open and reveal a truth even darker than murder. If you've made it this far, you need to see how this ends. Subscribe now because what comes next will change everything you thought you understood about this case. Ron Halstead's house sat empty on a quiet street in Mesa, exactly as it had been since his death 3 weeks earlier. His children lived out of state and hadn't yet dealt with the property, leaving it frozen in time, a monument to a life everyone thought they understood. Detective Hart stood on the front porch with a search warrant in hand, though technically she didn't need one. Halstead's daughter had given permission, grateful that someone was willing to sort through decades of accumulated belongings. She had no idea what Hart was really looking for. The house smelled of dust and medicine, that particular scent of illness and dying that clings to walls long after the person is gone. Hart moved through the rooms methodically, her team of 2 officers spreading out to cover ground faster. They were looking for anything connected to 1986, any evidence Halstead might have kept as insurance or trophy. What they found was in the garage. Tucked in the back corner, behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old tools, was a large storage trunk with a combination lock. Hart's pulse quickened as she examined it. The lock was old but maintained, recently oiled, suggesting Halstead had accessed it regularly even in his final years. It took a locksmith 30 minutes to crack it open. Inside, carefully organized in plastic sleeves and labeled folders, was Ron Halstead's insurance policy. Documentation of every crime he'd committed over 3 decades of corruption. Bank statements showing deposits that didn't match his salary. Photographs of merchandise being moved. Names, dates, locations. He'd documented his own criminal empire with the precision of a man who understood that information was power, even from beyond the grave. And at the bottom of the trunk, in a manila envelope marked 1986 Brooks, Hart found what she'd been searching for. Grace's missing diary pages, not just the one that had been logged into evidence, but 7 additional pages that had been torn out and hidden. Pages where Grace had documented everything she'd witnessed, everyone she'd seen, every detail of the criminal operation running through Mesa. Hart's hands trembled as she read Grace's handwriting, neat and methodical despite the fear bleeding through every word. July 28th, Saw Mark and a police officer loading boxes into a truck behind the diner. The officer's name tag said Halstead. Mark saw me watching and looked terrified. Officer Halstead smiled and waved like nothing was wrong. I don't know what to do. August 2nd. Mark keeps trying to be friendly, asking if I told anyone what I saw. I lied and said I didn't see anything, but I'm writing everything down in case something happens to me. Mom always says the truth is the most powerful protection. August 8th, Officer Halstead came to our house today. Talked to Mom about neighborhood safety. He looked at me the whole time like he was sending a message. I'm scared. I think I need to tell someone. But who do you tell when the person threatening you is the police? August 12th, I've decided. I'm going to report everything to the FBI office in Phoenix. I have documentation, dates, descriptions. Mark doesn't know I've been recording license plate numbers. I just need to survive 2 more days until my day off. 2 more days. But Grace never got those 2 days. The final entry was dated August 14th, the day she disappeared. Officer Halstead came to the diner during my shift. Said he knows I've been documenting things that Mark told him about my diary. He said he wants to help me, that he can make sure the right people get my information safely. He wants to meet me after my shift tonight. Says he'll drive me to make the report. I don't trust him, but I don't know what else to do. If you're reading this and I'm not around to tell my story, please know that I tried to do the right thing. Please tell Mom I love her. Heart's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Grace had walked into that meeting knowing she was in danger, knowing Halstead might hurt her, but believing so completely in the power of truth and justice that she'd taken the risk anyway. She'd been betrayed by the very system meant to protect her. But the diary pages weren't the only thing in the envelope. There was also a folded map, yellowed with age, with a specific location marked in red ink. Written beside the mark in Halstead's handwriting were the words, "Insurance and leave buried." Hart spread the map across the hood of her car, comparing it to the topographical maps Ethan had marked. The location matched almost exactly. The dried creek bed about a 1/4 mile off the old service road. Halstead had kept a map to Grace's grave for 38 years. But why? Why document the murder site, the diary pages, all the evidence that could destroy him? Hart's mind raced through possibilities until one horrifying explanation crystallized. Halstead had kept everything as leverage, as blackmail insurance against anyone who might have turned on him. If Ethan or Mark ever threatened to talk, Halstead could prove they were involved too. Mutually assured destruction. He'd turned Grace's murder into a weapon he could wield from beyond the grave. Hart immediately authorized a full search operation. Within hours, ground-penetrating radar units, cadaver dogs, and a forensic anthropology team were assembled in the desert. The location Halstead had marked was technically public land, which simplified the legal complications of excavation. The search began at dawn the next morning. Hart stood at the edge of the dried creek bed as the team worked, watching the ground-penetrating radar operator move slowly across the sand. The technology could detect disturbances in soil composition, anomalies that suggested something had been buried and left undisturbed for decades. It took less than 30 minutes to find her. The radar showed a clear disruption in the soil layers about 4 feet down, roughly the size and shape of a human body. The team marked the location with flags and began the careful process of excavation, treating the site like the crime scene it was, even after all these years. Hart watched as layers of desert sand were carefully removed, each shovelful bringing them closer to the truth that had been buried in 1986. The sun climbed higher, heat shimmering off the sand, and Hart thought about Grace Brooks walking into the desert on the last night of her life, believing in justice even as it failed her. By noon, they'd uncovered the first evidence, fragments of fabric deteriorated by time but still recognizable as denim. Grace's backpack, the one witnesses had seen her carrying, the one that didn't belong to her because Halstead had given it to her, filled with false promises of safety. And then, as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, they found Grace herself. The forensic team worked with reverent silence, carefully exposing bones that had waited 38 years to tell their story. Hart saw the small skeleton, forever frozen at 16, and felt something break inside her chest. Not grief exactly, but a deep, aching rage at the injustice of it all. Grace Brooks had been found. But the discovery would reveal one final devastating truth that neither Ethan nor Mark had mentioned. a truth that would rewrite everything Hart thought she understood about the night Grace died. The forensic anthropologist called Hart over, her voice tight with professional restraint barely masking horror. "Detective, you need to see this." And what Hart saw in that moment would haunt her for the rest of her life. Don't stop now. The final chapters reveal the truth that changes everything. If this story has moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because Grace Brooks's voice deserves to be heard after 38 years of silence. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, knelt beside the excavation site with the careful reverence of someone who understood that bones were more than evidence. They were the final testament of a life stolen too soon. She'd spent 20 years studying skeletal remains, reading stories written in fractures and trauma, but something about this case had shaken even her professional detachment. "What is it?" Hart asked, crouching beside her. Dr. Chen pointed to Grace's skull, specifically to a fracture pattern on the left temporal bone. "This injury is consistent with blunt force trauma, significant force, probably a single blow from a heavy object. It would have caused immediate unconsciousness, possibly death." Hart nodded grimly. "So Halstead killed her quickly." "That's what I thought at first," Dr. Chen said, her voice dropping. "But look at this." She carefully indicated other bones, the ribs, the right arm. These fractures showed different characteristics. They're older, showing signs of healing. These injuries occurred weeks, possibly months before her death. Hart's blood went cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Grace Brooks was being physically abused before she was murdered, repeatedly. These aren't accidents. The fracture patterns suggest defensive wounds and direct assault. Someone was hurting this girl for a long time before they finally killed her." The desert seemed to tilt around Hart. She'd assumed Grace's suffering began and ended the night she disappeared, a single terrible event in an otherwise normal life. But these bones told a different story, one of prolonged violence, of secret pain that Grace had hidden from everyone, even her own mother. "Can you determine who inflicted these injuries?" Hart asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Not from the bones alone," Dr. Chen admitted. "But the timing is significant. These healed fractures are consistent with injuries sustained in the months leading up to her disappearance, the same period when she was documenting Halstead's criminal activities." Hart stood abruptly, her mind racing through implications. Halstead hadn't just murdered Grace to protect his criminal enterprise. He'd been systematically abusing her, using violence to intimidate her into silence, escalating from threats to physical assault when fear alone wasn't enough to control her. But there was something else, something that didn't fit the pattern. Hart pulled out Grace's diary pages again, reading them with new understanding. Grace never mentioned being hurt, never documented injuries. For someone so meticulous about recording criminal activity, why wouldn't she document her own abuse? Unless she was protecting someone. Hart's phone rang, jarring her from dark thoughts. It was the junior detective she'd assigned to background research on everyone connected to the case. "Detective Hart, I found something in Mark Delaney's old records," the detective said, excitement crackling through the phone. "He was arrested twice in 1985 for domestic assault against a girlfriend. Charges were dropped both times, but guess who intervened on his behalf?" Hart's stomach dropped. "Ron Halstead." "Exactly. Halstead vouched for Mark, said he was a good kid who made mistakes, got the charges sealed. I only found them because I went through physical archives." The pieces were rearranging themselves into a picture Hart hadn't anticipated. Mark Delaney wasn't just involved in the theft operation. He had a documented history of violence against women, violence that Halstead had actively covered up and enabled. Hart drove directly from the excavation site to the detention center where Mark was being held. She found him in an interview room, looking smaller and more frightened than during their first conversation. His attorney started to object to questioning without notice, but Hart cut her off. "Tell me about Grace's injuries," Hart said, her voice like ice. Mark's face went ashen. "What injuries?" "The ones you gave her. The broken ribs, the fractured arm. The months of abuse before you and Halstead finally killed her." "I never—" Mark started, then stopped, his expression shifting from confusion to horrified realization. "Oh God, you think I hurt her?" "You have a history of domestic violence," Hart pressed. Halstead covered it up for you, and Grace's remains show repeated trauma consistent with assault. Mark's hands shook violently as he gripped the edge of the table. Detective, I swear on my children's lives I never laid a hand on Grace. Those arrests were from before I even met her, and Halstead helped me because he was building leverage over me, making sure I owed him. But I never hurt Grace. She was just a kid working at the diner. I barely even talked to her until... He stopped abruptly, a new horror dawning in his eyes. Until what? Hart demanded. Mark's voice came out in a broken whisper. Until Halstead started paying special attention to her. I thought he was just worried about her talking. But the way he looked at her sometimes, the way he'd find excuses to show up at the diner during her shifts. He trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. Hart felt nausea rise in her throat as the full picture crystallized. Ron Halstead hadn't just been a corrupt cop running a criminal operation. He'd been a predator who'd targeted Grace Brooks, using his authority and power to abuse her, while simultaneously threatening her into silence about the theft ring. Grace had been trapped in a nightmare with no escape. If she reported the criminal activity, Halstead would hurt her. If she reported the abuse, who would believe her over a decorated police officer? She'd tried to document everything, tried to find a way out, and it had gotten her killed. Did you know? Hart asked Mark. Did you know he was hurting her? Mark's face crumpled. I suspected something was wrong. Grace started flinching when Halstead came near her, started working different shifts to avoid him. But I told myself it wasn't my business, that I was imagining things. I chose not to see because seeing would have meant doing something, and I was too much of a coward. Hart wanted to hit him, wanted to scream at him for his willful blindness, for choosing his own safety over a teenage girl's life. But she forced herself to remain professional, to extract every piece of information that might help her understand Grace's final days. The night she disappeared, Hart said carefully, Halstead met with her after her shift. What happened? I don't know the details, Mark said, tears streaming down his face. Halstead told me to make sure she worked closing, that he'd handle the rest. The next day he said the problem was solved, that Grace wouldn't be talking to anyone. I thought maybe he'd scared her enough to leave town. I wanted to believe that's all it was. But you knew better. I knew better, Mark confirmed. Especially when her mother started putting up missing posters and Halstead assigned himself to help with the investigation. That's when I realized what solved really meant. Hart stood, her decision crystallizing. You're going to tell all of this to a grand jury. Every detail, every suspicion, every moment you chose to look away while a 16-year-old girl was being abused and terrorized. You're going to make sure everyone knows who Ron Halstead really was. What difference does it make now? Mark asked bitterly. He's dead. He got away with everything. Hart leaned across the table, her voice low and fierce. He didn't get away with anything. His name will be destroyed. His family will know what he was. History will remember him not as a decorated officer, but as a murderer and predator. And Grace Brooks will finally get the justice she deserved 38 years ago. As Hart walked out of the detention center, her phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Chen. The forensic team had found something else at the burial site, something wrapped in plastic and buried alongside Grace's body. A piece of evidence so damning that even death couldn't protect Ron Halstead's legacy anymore. The final chapter is coming, and it will reveal the last piece of this devastating puzzle. If you've stayed with Grace's story this far, don't leave now. Subscribe and share this story, because the truth has waited long enough to be told. The package buried with Grace Brooks was wrapped in multiple layers of heavy plastic, sealed with duct tape that had somehow survived 3 decades in the desert soil. Dr. Chen's team extracted it with painstaking care, treating it as both evidence and artifact, a message from the past that someone had desperately wanted preserved. Detective Hart watched as the forensic team carefully opened the package in the controlled environment of the lab. Inside was a Ziploc bag, and inside that bag was a cassette tape. The label, written in Grace's handwriting, read, "If something happens to me, August 14th, 1986. Hart's hands trembled as she held the tape. Grace had known. She'd known she was walking into danger that night, and she'd created insurance of her own, a voice from beyond the grave that would speak when she no longer could. The lab had to locate a cassette player from storage, the technology so outdated that even finding working equipment took effort. When they finally pressed play, Grace's voice filled the room. Young, scared but determined. My name is Grace Elizabeth Brooks. It's 9:15 on August 14th, 1986. If you're listening to this, it means I didn't survive tonight. I'm recording this before I meet Deputy Ron Halstead because I don't trust him, and I need someone to know the truth. Hart closed her eyes listening to a dead girl's testimony. For the past 2 months, Deputy Halstead has been assaulting me. It started after I witnessed him and my co-worker Mark Delaney moving stolen merchandise behind the diner. Halstead came to my house, acted friendly in front of my mom, then cornered me alone. He said if I told anyone what I saw, he'd make sure my mother was arrested for drug possession. He said he could plant evidence and no one would question a cop's word against ours. Grace's voice cracked slightly, but she continued. He started showing up at the diner, making me meet him after shifts. He'd take me to his truck and hurt me. He said it was to remind me what happens to girls who cause problems. I tried to fight back once, and he broke my arm. Told everyone I fell. I couldn't go to the hospital because he said he'd make it worse if I did. Hart opened her eyes to find her entire team standing in stunned silence, some with tears streaming down their faces. This wasn't just evidence anymore. It was a witness to evil that had gone unchallenged for 38 years. I documented everything in my diary, Grace's voice continued. Every date, every time he hurt me, every detail about the stolen merchandise. I was going to take it to the FBI in Phoenix on my day off. But tonight, Halstead told me he knows about my documentation. He wants to meet me after my shift to talk about a solution. He smiled when he said it, but his eyes were dead. There was a long pause filled with the sound of Grace's shaky breathing. I'm scared. I know I shouldn't go, but if I don't, he'll hurt my mom. He's made that clear. So I'm going to meet him, but I'm leaving this tape with my diary pages in a waterproof bag behind the dumpster at the diner. If I survive tonight, I'll retrieve it tomorrow. If I don't, please find it. Please make sure everyone knows what Ron Halstead really is. Another pause, then Grace's voice came back softer, more vulnerable. Mom, if you're hearing this, I'm so sorry. I tried to protect you. I tried to do the right thing. I love you so much. Please don't blame yourself. This isn't your fault. It's his. Remember me as someone who tried to stand up against evil, even when I was terrified, and please, please make sure he doesn't hurt anyone else the way he hurt me. The tape continued for another minute. Grace's breathing, the sound of her crying quietly, then her voice one final time. It's 9:45 now. I have to go meet him. Whoever finds this, bring him to justice. Don't let him win. The tape clicked off. The silence in the lab was absolute, broken only by the sound of people struggling not to sob. Hart stood motionless, Grace's final words echoing in her mind. The girl had been braver than most adults Hart had known, facing down a predator with a badge while simultaneously trying to protect her mother and document evidence for a justice she'd never lived to see. The bag wasn't behind the dumpster, Hart said quietly, piecing it together. Halstead must have found it before meeting Grace. He knew she had evidence, so he brought it with him when he buried her. Kept it as insurance, just like everything else. But Halstead had made one fatal miscalculation. He'd assumed he'd die before anyone looked hard enough to find the truth. He'd assumed that death would protect his legacy, that the grave would keep all secrets buried forever. He was wrong. Hart immediately authorized the release of all evidence to the media. Within hours, the story broke. Not just Grace's murder, but the full scope of Ron Halstead's crimes. His decades of corruption, his abuse of power, his predation of a teenage girl who'd tried desperately to expose him. His family released a statement expressing shock and horror. His former colleagues scrambled to distance themselves from his legacy. The mayor ordered a full review of every case Halstead had ever touched. His name was removed from the memorial wall honoring fallen officers, because predators don't deserve honor regardless of their badges. Most importantly, Hart drove to a small house on the outskirts of Mesa where Grace's mother, now 72 and frail, still lived alone. She played the tape for her, held her while she wept, and watched as 38 years of unanswered questions finally received their terrible, heartbreaking resolution. She was so brave, Grace's mother whispered through her tears. My baby was so brave. She was, Hart agreed. And because of her bravery, we found the truth. She made sure justice would find her even if it took 38 years. Ethan Ward and Mark Delaney both received lengthy prison sentences as accessories to kidnapping and murder. Their confessions, combined with Grace's tape and Halstead's documentation, ensured there would be no plea deals, no early parole. They would spend the rest of their lives paying for their cowardice and complicity. Grace Brooks was buried beside her grandmother in a ceremony attended by hundreds of people who'd never met her, but felt they knew her story. Her grave marker read, Grace Elizabeth Brooks, 1970-1986. She stood for truth. Detective Lena Hart stood at that grave long after everyone else had left, thinking about a 16-year-old girl who'd been failed by every system meant to protect her, but who'd still refused to let evil win without a fight. "We found you," Hart whispered to the headstone, "and we made sure everyone knows your name. Some treasures aren't buried in sand but in the hearts that refuse to forget." Grace Brooks's voice was silenced in 1986, but her truth echoes louder now than it ever could have in life, a reminder that justice delayed is still justice worth fighting for, and that some voices are too powerful to bury forever. If this story moved you, honor Grace's memory by sharing it. Subscribe to hear more stories of truth that refuse to stay buried. And remember, evil only wins when good people choose silence. Grace Brooks chose to speak, and her voice changed everything.